I am a Brit underneath the American twang. I'm part of the SME team at Cloudera. We have specialists around different verticals. Sean, who was on earlier, is also part of the same group as me. So my background is sort of prior to Cloudera, and I've been here just almost 2 years, which is a long time in this space. I was at Ardent Essential IBM. If you're familiar with DataStage, I built out a lot of that stack. And then IBM has a whole suite of governance, profiling, quality tools, which is, of course, very relevant to this discussion. And then with me is Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Moore. I'm a solutions engineer with a company called Trifecta. We do data preparation on Hadoop and on Cloudera. So the intent for, I think, today's session is to kind of give you some background on how you would be able to leverage Hadoop, specifically for financial services, and then I'm going to take you through a demonstration of how we can illustrate the art of the possible of doing that with the tool itself, so you'll get to see a little bit of live demonstration instead of just slideware, so that'll be good.
Okay, so we're going to tag team this a little bit. So I always like starting with this slide. So if you're sitting there thinking that's a 1 1/4 inch 1.44 meg floppy drive, you're all aging yourself. Because if that's what you're thinking, you're definitely over 18. Because if you're under 18, this is the save button, and you have no idea why. So I like this slide is because when I was a kid growing up, you had a big data problem when your computer software came on 22 of these, and you didn't know where to store them. Prior to that, my dad, used to work for Xopen and ICL, and he had a big data problem when you were getting paper cuts from all the ticker tape. Big data is very different. The modern version of one of these is a jump drive, a zip drive. And yet, think about the last time you used a zip drive. People use things like Dropbox and Box and Google Drive to share stuff. They use a completely different way of doing things. I grew up, my first career out of university was with a company selling data warehousing. It was one of the first companies, and you were Inman or Kimberlite. But today, it's a completely different world. It isn't the answer to just have a bigger, larger data warehouse, just like the answer isn't to have a zip drive. People share data in completely different ways. So Tom Riley, our CEO, makes a point of not liking the term big data. He likes to talk about new data. And I really do agree with that. And all the customers I go and see, it's not a case of this thing called big data is what's changing what they're doing. It's the fact they're using new data. So I sort of spend all my time in the FinServ space. I occasionally go cross vertical into different industries, mainly in tooling discussions. But I basically get to live with people doing stuff at the real cutting edge of FinServ. And also now there's this huge influx of smaller organizations that are getting into Hadoop and big data as a whole. So we're seeing a couple of different drivers across this space. So firstly, everyone today has kind of talked about data growth. There's also this massive disruption going on in how you interact with consumers. They feel they're interacting with a brand, and they use multiple different devices and mechanisms to interact, and you have to work with all of those. Fraud is increasingly being seen as an issue where there's an opportunity for cost takeout, and the cyber attack piece, anytime you have data, it is in some way a threat. So protecting that from both insider and outsider threats. And then the one thing that's consistent, every financial organization I go to, is that there are regulations and they expect them to change more and get more intense in the future. So at the same time, Cloudera is seeing a couple of key themes about how people are trying to use data. So firstly, customer insight, this interest in the customer journey, the interaction with the brand, the ability to improve products and services to sort of take this vast amount of data, a lot of IoT data coming in now as well, and then the business risk side, just taking risk out of the business. So there are a lot of sort of challenges with the existing way you do data management. I spent all my career with data. The coolest thing about big data, on a side note, is the fact that now when you go to a party, I used to sort of, when people said, what do you do? I would mumble about plumbing and data. Now you can say I'm involved in data science and big data, and people will recognize it, and they think it's cool, and they won't try and avoid eye contact. So that's definitely a good thing. But there are still a lot of these challenges across all these different verticals. people still predominantly deal with structured data. There is so much value in the unstructured data that people aren't taking advantage of because it's too expensive. There's definitely an issue just around how you view it across the different silos. Today, you would probably go out and buy a risk application, a fraud application, a marketing application platform, a Salesforce automation system, all as separate silos. And the ability to blend data, we're seeing more and more organizations that realize that they have all this data, but even if they could bring it together in one place, how do they blend it and match it across those different sources? So I use this slide in pretty much every customer presentation I do. And I've spent 45 minutes with a particular customer just going through this one slide. We won't do that today, but this is new data. This is the data you already have today that you can't take full advantage of because you're sampling it. You're taking a subset. You have to store it in a time window data warehouse. This is the opportunity. This is the new data you can bring in. And any one of these, we could spend a huge amount of time discussing, the detail beneath each. But, things like weather data, it's a massive opportunity. I've seen execs get more excited about blending weather data with an existing source than a 20 million cost saving out of their data warehouse. So you have to kind of pick the right one. But these C's along the bottom, in financial services, they care about the 4 C's. Compliance. Whatever you spend money on, it must be compliant. Your compliance comes first. You'd love to spend money on cost savings. You'd love to spend money on customer insight. You'd love to spend it differentiating from your competition. But you have to do the first one first. I was with a CIO from a very large bank. His office is bigger than my New York apartment. And he very casually mentioned that he had spent almost $50 million last year more on compliance than he planned to spend. So 2 things are scary about that. Firstly, $50 million more than he planned to spend. The second is, it was okay with that because he has to do it. It's compliance. And what's really interesting to me about Hadoop and the technology that Mr. Cutting and Mr. Olson kind of drove into the market is that you can use the data you have to keep for compliance for other things as well. The same data you use for compliance today, you can use for cost savings. You can use for customer insight. I was with a chief data officer in a meeting, and I kind of threw out the fact that I had seen customers take cost centers and turn them into profit centers. So he called me out on it, and he said, "Which customer are you talking about?" So I named the customer, at which point he said, "Oh, that guy used to work for me." I then went through the use case. So this particular customer was spending about $1 billion on their data warehouse. They'd spent a lot of time and money building it up. It provided a time-windowed view. They realized they could take some cost out by moving some of the ETL processing out. They realized they could take out a couple of the data centers. And that saved, a couple of $100 million. What they then realized is that they could sell that data back to customers. They could monetize it. That created a $1 billion revenue opportunity for them. So a large cost center became a slightly profitable center. I had never seen anything like that. The interesting thing was he apparently called the guy up to check my story out and sent me a nice email asking for my deck later that day. So you genuinely are seeing with this technology, people turning cost centers into profit centers. I'm not telling you they're going to become massive profit centers, but all these organizations are realizing there is the opportunity to monetize an asset that is littered across your organization today. Now, not every organization can do that. Given we're here in public sector areas, I'm not suggesting that you sell all the data you have. But there is definitely the opportunity, and at the very least, to combine it in interesting ways. Across agencies, there is so much opportunity for you to use that data better. So these are some of the broad use case categories we see. I'm going to dive into a couple of specific examples, but whether people are looking at risk and compliance or fraud or product enhancement, the thing that most people are settling on is they want to do these other things, but customer experience or the ability to map a customer journey through all the different touch points is really where they see a lot of the value. On the FinServ side, risk and compliance is just something you have to do. I'm also seeing people do some really interesting stuff. Like you've seen, there's a couple of sessions today on cybersecurity. We're seeing people blend the idea of cybersecurity with VAR. VAR is a calculation in FinServ about value at risk. Our inability to do a good job of VAR is part of what caused the last financial crisis. But if you combine VAR with cybersecurity, the guy who wrote the book on VAR is actually kind of exploring things like that. So there's some really interesting opportunities around this area. But just to dig into Customer 360 a little bit. So if you're trying to do Customer 360 today, and Customer 360 can sometimes have somewhat of a bad connotation because people have tried to do it a lot. So customer journeys and journey science is how people sometimes refer to it now. You have multiple data silos across the organization. You have all these different feeds and touch points across your brand with customers. The volumes are getting crazy. Banking, it's pretty intense. Telco, it's even more insane. If you saw Sean's presentation on the Omics side earlier, he claimed they have the largest data set. You're also having new and different interaction points. And the cost is prohibitive. If you look at existing data warehouses today, people will budget between $20,000 and $100,000 a terabyte for storage, let alone processing. And most data warehouses have become places where there's a huge amount of transformation happening inside the warehouse, is ELT, which is, SQL is not great for ELT anyway, but there's so much opportunity just for cost takeout on those. So you can spend more money on Teradata and Netezza and these other things by taking some of that ELT processing out and putting it into the Hadoop layer. Staging is a very good target for the data warehouse, for Hadoop. So you're trying to build up this kind of almost like a gene of the customer that you're interacting with. You want to look at every different channel. You want to know how they're interacting with you. Are they having a good time in that interaction? What's their NPS in every point of that? How much business we're doing with them? How much business could we do with them? And it's this opportunity that Hadoop is really well suited for. It can blend structured and unstructured data. You can apply the schema later. I talked about this earlier, but two things you should learn about Hadoop. Firstly, the cost point. It's a completely different cost point. The second is schema on read. If you've heard of a schema is how you apply structure. Often people think about rows and columns, Excel style, in a database. In Hadoop, you can throw the data in and apply the schema on need or read flexibly. You still have to pay the price of applying the schema, but it means you can throw data in and then dynamically change the schema to fit your use case. It changes the time to deployment of, if you go to most customers today and you ask honestly the business team who are using an existing data warehouse what their biggest pain points are, it's that it takes 6 to 9 months to get a new column in. It takes 6 to 9 months to get a new report, and they're being asked by the business to respond in days. There's a massive delta between the two. If you use that approach where you can throw the data in, flexibly apply the schema, and especially with Hadoop, people are using a fail fast. So they'll try a data set and then try a different data set. It actually fits very nicely with what Chris is going to talk on about this whole concept of data wrangling. It sounds kind of funny with an English accent, I'm sure, but wrangling data is the ability to kind of let users go in and play with the data in a self-service manner in a way that wasn't possible in those traditional systems. So we have some awesome customers doing Customer 360. The Santander guys happen to be a favorite of mine. So Santander, large European bank, their first use case was they wanted to basically show value from all this data they were getting from account transactions. So this required every account transaction to flow in, to be able to process it in some interesting way, and feed it back to users. So they decided to launch an app called Spendlytics. Sounds really simple. We're going to launch an app on the iPhone that people are going to download, and it's going to basically aggregate and show in near real time all their account data. You try doing that in an existing system. It's going to cost you a fortune. You're going to spend an awful lot of time doing it. In a very short amount of weeks and months, this went from idea to prototype to something they rolled out across the organization. You can go to the App Store. You can download this. If you have a Santander account, you can then, and they're using stuff like, and I apologize, when it comes to Hadoop, you're going to hear a lot of zoo animal names. Just a side comment note on that. So before I came to Cloudera, I was at IBM, and I ran a product team. So what happens in those organizations is when you're coming up with the next release, so let's say the next release that we were working on was Data Stage. The actual product name is IBM InfoSphere Data Stage Release 8, which is not really rolling off the tongue, and also isn't something that's easy to get the engineering teams excited about. So you have a code name. Internally, the code name for that release was Hawk. So we had pictures of hawks. 3 months from when the product gets released, the marketing team comes in, you've got to rebrand all this, and it's going to be IBM InfoSphere Data Stage Release 8. The only difference between open source and the other vendors is that crazy name that we use internally, like Impala makes it into the outside world. We put the software through the same QA cycle. So when you hear things like Kafka is just a name for a message queue layer. Pretty much every financial services organization I see now is kind of using this as a drop layer. It can take streaming data, pass it through, incredible volumes of data going through this. So risk and compliance. So people have spent a long time building up risk and compliance architectures inside these organizations. They will buy very expensive risk management platforms. They have a certain amount of data they have to store over time. And the regulations that are driving this are things like CCAR. CCAR is a stringent sort of security rule about, and VAR is a subcomponent of this, about how much risk exposure a particular organization has. There are GSIBs, these globally systematic important banks, that have to go through a CCAR stress test every year. If you fail the stress test, you get a very large fine. So there's real motivation to satisfy this. BCBS 239 is 14 rules and regulations about how you manage and expose risk and report on risk inside the business. Know your customer, related to AML type activities. So there are these federally driven regulations that then in turn force organizations to have to report on these. And the CCAR requirements, for example, change every year. If you fail your stress test 2 times in a year, the next time you get through more scrutiny, the fine gets larger, and we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for these as well. So people have built up in these organizations architectures to try and deal with risk today. Oftentimes they'll have an HPC grid, they'll use a large data warehouse to try and do this. They'll use applications to drive this down into sort of the processing layer, and every point of this can break. You've got difficulty with the unstructured data. If it takes you 9 months to get a new column into a report, imagine what it takes to change a risk calculation that you have to repeat every year and change every year. Archival of data becomes a big issue because you have to show how you've complied before. So Hadoop is fitting very well here because structured and unstructured data volumes are completely different in terms of the cost point. The ability to add processing frameworks on top. Again, I hate to talk too many sort of technical words, but Spark is a really interesting processing framework that has kind of evolved over the last few years. Cloudera was a big supporter of Spark early, but what we see is really interesting is people building new functionality into Spark. Just to give you an example, one of our data scientists was working with a large bank that was doing VAR. He basically went in, he knows Spark very well, he doesn't know VAR. Over a few days, he basically figured out how to do VAR in Spark. And really nice guy, very modest. He's apologizing to the customer, hey, it's my first go at doing this. It was running 100 times faster than what they did today on all of their data. Customers jumping up and down, the guy was kind of apologizing, I can make it go faster. So, things like Spark can completely change the way you're doing things today. One of my favorite customers in this space, you may have heard of FINRA. FINRA is a regulatory body behind the stock exchange. So they basically look at all of the data coming from the stock exchange, up to 50 billion events a day. They put it into a massive graph series model. And what they're looking for is for any stock transaction, all of the communications from all the different brokerages around that. They're looking to basically find people who are doing things they shouldn't be so that they can prosecute them. They are an insanely smart customer as well, disclaimer. And even more interestingly, about 10 years ago when I was at a previous company, we built the system and they were building it on the technology that I used to be involved in. So it's been incredible to see these guys rebuild the system. In terms of what they handle and the volume of data coming in, it is insane. It's all done in Amazon, so it's a very flexible scale up and scale down architecture. And the coolest thing about FINRA as well is, so as a regulatory body, they have been working on this project called HERD, which is a sort of management layer for that, and they've open sourced it. So now you're seeing regulators getting involved in open source as well. And from our side, great customer, and just, I often end up with people who are downstream of these people who are complaining about how much data they have to give to FINRA. And you're like, yeah, you don't know what's downstream of you, it's us. We're bringing all that data in. So it's a very interesting use case and discussion. So fraud. Fraud is a very interesting area. As more organizations kind of wake up to what's possible here, there are lots of legacy fraud applications. They tend to be batch file orientated. They're very rules heavy. They're very static on the rules. You're dealing with multiple data silos. With technology sitting on top of Hadoop, you can do, like Kafka, you can do real-time packet extraction. Well, one of the largest banks in the US runs every transaction through a Cloudera-based system. They do both what's called online and offline fraud analysis. Online is the sub-second card response. Offline is the full forensic analysis piece. You can then apply machine learning to this, so you can start looking at where cards may be compromised. So the most interesting thing about fraud is, if you look at an existing system, you could go out and buy a fraud application today. If you run that on top of Hadoop, think about how fraud used to be. It used to be that you would steal a credit card, you would go and buy a big screen TV as soon as possible, you would dip the card in a gas station to see if it was still valid. That's not what people do with fraud today. They'll compromise a whole set of cards, they'll compromise a merchant ID, they'll ping the merchant ID to see if those cards are still valid. They'll then do a number of small transactions, trying to stay under the waterline of visibility. So you can, using Spark and other things, spot those fraudsters. But just for a second, think about that. What do your best customers do? Your best customers don't come in once a year and buy a TV. They come in every week, they do a number of small transactions, and they add up. The same data you're using to find fraud, you could use to identify your best customers, and instead of prosecuting them and trying to take them out of the system, you could encourage them to repeat that behavior. It's the same data. The most insane thing about Hadoop is you can suddenly use the same data set across both these sides. And not only is there things like Spark, there's machine learning technologies on top, and you can really start looking forward. One of those data scientists, I was out in Asia, in Indonesia, and he was working at a telco looking for compromised handsets. So he spent all day trying to figure out, in this particular area, we're likely to get handsets be compromised, and then that logic allows them to establish better monitoring of those systems. So they'll look if the chip ID on a SIM goes down. He then went to a bank, and the bank was like, "Oh, we're completely different to anyone else. Your telco experience is no importance here." The logic you use to look for a compromised card is exactly the same on the science level from a compromised handset. So these verticals, they think they're so different, but really they're not at the lower levels. So in terms of the stack, so Cloudera has this enterprise data hub. We treat it like a software product. We QA it and release it. But it's the partner ecosystem that makes all the difference. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of these presentations with Chris, and vendors like Trifecta that sit on top of it and integrate deeply with the stack are really how you add the value. We provide the operating system. They provide the Word, Excel, PowerPoint type applications that get people really excited. So I'm going to give them a chance to sort of show off what Trifecta can do.
Excellent, thanks. So yeah, like I was saying earlier, so Trifecta is the leading data wrangling tool in the ecosystem for Hadoop. So what we do is we sit on your Hadoop cluster, and we essentially are providing a view to the data that your analysts or your data science teams or anybody would like to begin using, and that allow them to interrogate the data, transform the data, and ultimately prepare a data set that would be useful for the modeling or for the reporting that they're trying to do. This was pioneered out of a Stanford research project called Data Wrangler. And from there, they received, after that went live, they received about 30,000 downloads in a very short amount of time. And so they said, well, maybe we can put some money behind this and make a product out of it. So what this tool does is it's very, it's non-specific. So it's not vertical specific, it's vertical agnostic. So we do have companies that we're working with that basically range the spectrum. So we work with financial services, obviously, which is where my background primarily was spent. But we also do a lot of work in telco and healthcare and pharma. So we have a very diverse set of users. And in all of them, they have basically the same challenge, which is they want to be able to land these new and interesting data sets for their analysts and their data scientists to be able to leverage, but they need to be able to do it in a way that allows them to flexibly move through the data set and begin to understand what they're dealing with and prepare something that they find would be useful. And oftentimes, they also find that that data is not necessarily useful and they want to be able to quickly discard it. So this tool gives them that capacity. Now, the demonstration I'll take you through today, again, kind of as I prefixed all of this, it's a demonstration that's meant to illustrate the art of the possible with Hadoop. So what we do is we want to be able to take the different types of diverse data sets that, in this case, a financial services organization, or even most organizations these days would go through, things like news feed data, ticker data and trades in financial services, large volumes of information coming off of the stock exchange or the newswire, operational logs, all types of information. And what we want to do is we want to show how you can take that data set that doesn't necessarily have any structure and apply some structure to it, prepare it, and then ultimately serve it out for things like modeling or visualization and any of your leading tools that you see in the ecosystem. We don't want to replace your ETL layers. We don't want to replace your visualization layers. We're providing a self-service way for users to begin to work with the data, and we're giving them a far faster ability to prepare that data in a quality way for their visualizations and things like Qlik and Tableau. So let me just jump in, actually. Let's see if I can get out of that. So again, to illustrate the art of the possible, the way that this whole demonstration starts off is with a data set that you might encounter that would look something like this. This is a series of unstructured or semi-structured data about information coming off of the newswire. So as corporate actions are breaking, as interesting things are happening in the marketplace, this is landing in real time in your cluster in very large volume. And now what we want to do is make this available to somebody to allow us to create a blended data set of both this news data and the stock ticker or trade data in order to find out, was there a trade that was potentially placed prior to the news breaking on the wire, which may indicate some form of insider trading or insider information being passed to that trader or that trader desktop before the news actually officially broke. So let's see how we can do that. This news data, by the way, when you first bring it into a tool like Trifecta, will render in a way that looks similar to this. So this is the Trifecta tool, where now what Trifecta uses is a heavy reliance upon machine learning and pattern inferencing to try to ascertain shape and structure of data. So we can see here that we're beginning to break out some of the patterns within the data set, like date and time, title, content, some other things that would make this useful for somebody to now begin wrangling. And so the purpose for the tool that we're bringing to the market is to allow the user, without any hand coding knowledge or any special scripting, be able to interact with this data physically with the mouse. So you'll notice here we have some date and time information, and we're presenting a series of things like histograms about the distribution of the values, and also a data quality bar, which points out, based on the valid patterns we see in the data set, how many valid, invalid, or in some cases mismatched values do we see in this particular set of data. And what we can do is we can allow the user to simply click right on that bar and get presented a series of suggestions along the bottom of what they might want to do to prepare that data. And in this case, what we could do is we could filter out the invalid patterns that you see in the preview, like there's like input mask information here. So I can just select delete, and I'll add that to my script, and that clears those patterns out of the data set. Now, what's important is we're reading the originating data and we're landing a new data set. We're not altering your originating data, so that stays as is. And we're just giving some inputs to the tool on how we want to prepare that. So I can take my missing values and I can remove those as well. And so now I've taken care of some of these patterns that I'm seeing. But even further to that, we're inferring data types. So things like date and time, social security numbers, potential PII are all being catered to here, as well as your own custom patterns. So if you have a custom pattern in your business that's germane to the work you're doing, you can register those and see those here as well. And we give you the ability to introspect information from any column in more detail by simply clicking on this column details. And what this view gives us in this case is a set of summary data about the validity of this column, about the top values and the distribution that we see, but also, given that this is date and time information, we'll paint a more granular view for things like day of the week or day of the month, so that if there's any natural seasonality to the data set, you'll see that here. And this allows us to provide to the user a capability that we call interactive profiling, which is where now they can just go ahead and simply click on a characteristic in the profile, like in this case the day of Wednesday, and be presented with a series of suggestions on what to do with perhaps the day of Wednesday. Maybe that's the day you need to do a roll-up report and that's the filter you want to apply. You simply click on Wednesday and take that action. So there's a lot of powerful functionality that we pack into the profiling, and that's being improved every day. And so from here, now the nature of wrangling is to simply allow the user to land a data set that they ultimately want to gain some information from without having to keep all of the attributes associated with it. So in this case, I can just very quickly drop down my menu and drop the title because I no longer require that. And now I'm left with this content of the news body. And so for somebody who understands this data, one of the things that they might want to pick out, obviously, is the stock ticker symbols from the news. We want to use that as our join criteria with our trader desktop data from the relational system. So what we allow the user to do is just simply swipe over the pattern within the news feed. In this case, that's the BlackBerry pattern for the BlackBerry security. And it starts to present some suggestions to me on what I might want to do with just BlackBerry. But I ultimately want all of the securities. So what we can do is we can allow the user to continually swipe over this pattern, and this will in turn refine the suggestion to the tool, and it says now maybe you want to isolate all of the different securities from within the news body, and that is in fact what I want to do. But what I really want to do is come and scroll across the suggestions I see along the bottom, and one of them is this extract list. And what this lets me do is it lets me isolate all of those patterns from within the news body into this sort of array looking function here on this new column. But what's interesting from here is that now I have this in this semi-structured format where I've isolated those ticker symbols. I can allow the user to click on the actual column itself, and I can select this unnest routine. And what this lets me do is it essentially lets me pivot that data set out, where now I've isolated those securities and I've put them on their own discrete line item within the data set. So now I can see that my news is repeating a few times here, and that's okay, but I do have all of the securities now isolated in their own independent column in the data set. And so I can drop this array function that I created earlier, and now I have those things broken out. And so very quickly I can allow the user to highlight the parentheses here and replace those with some null space. And what you'll notice is when I do this last one, the tool changes the inferred data type from a string to this valid ticker icon that you see here with the gear behind it. That's because we loaded some valid reference data about securities from the Dow or the NASDAQ in the background as reference data, where now we're evaluating the validity of these stock ticker symbols against that data. So now as I remove this last parenthesis, we can see that we do in fact have a few invalid or mismatched securities against that set of reference information. And so I can just go ahead and highlight those and remove those very quickly. And I can take care of any of my nulls that I have here also. And so in a very short amount of time, I've gone ahead and I've isolated all of the stock ticker symbols from the body of my news article that I was working in that looked a little daunting in the beginning. And I'll just simply allow myself to rename this column to tickers, something I can reference later. And one of the last things in our dashboard that we're interested in is the different types of corporate actions that might be breaking in the newswire that we want to use for a dashboard element in our visualization. So we can go ahead and select, in this case, something like profit warning might be interesting, right? So that might be an indicator that something's about to happen. I'm just going to go ahead and select this count pattern of profit warning, which allows me to basically derive a new column of how many times that pattern is occurring in the data set. And when we do this, we're going to take all of this information when we're done preparing it and push it down and run it at scale in Hadoop. So now I have this data prepared in a way that I can use it. Now I want to join this information with my Trader desktop data. And so I'll just click on my next tab here. And you'll notice that this data looks very relational. It's your standard type of relational data set. Similar types of attributes that you would see from a Trader desktop system. One of the things that we're noticing here as we're looking at the data is that this date and time column is down to the seconds and milliseconds, but our actual news feed is down to the minute. So what I want to do is I'm just going to go ahead and just quickly highlight over those seconds and milliseconds. And let me make sure I get the swipe right here because it does want you to swipe appropriately. And I'm doing it on this lectern. So now once I have this, what I'll get is a suggestion to replace those with some null space, which now allows me to pare down that time to the minute. And so everything I've done up till now has been visual in nature, but ultimately there may be data science folks or some analysts who want to impart their own knowledge on the data or do more complex manipulation. So what they can do is they can click on our transform editor where they can begin to interact with the tool in a much more detailed way, where they can do things like complex aggregations, calculations, extractions of key value pairs or ternaries. And in this case, I could just very simply do a derive column on this where I can take the price column and multiply it by the volume of my data set in order to get my the total of my trades. And so now you'll see I get a preview of what this new column will look like in the data set. I'll go ahead and add that to my script, and I'll change that to the name total. Okay, so now I've prepared this data. I have all of the attributes where I think I need them. Now I can go ahead and join this with my news. And so down at the bottom left, we provide a couple of different tools that are wizard-driven. We have a join tool, an aggregation tool, and a union wizard. And so when I click on the join tool, what we're going to do again is I'm going to select the news that I was working on earlier, And when I hit this select join keys, what happens is the tool uses, again, that pattern inferencing to try to suggest the best primary foreign key join relationship between two unrelated data sets. Given that one of these is coming from a database and the other one may be coming from a third party, we may not have an obvious join relationship that we can leverage. So in this case, we'll try to provide that guidance. You'll also see we're suggesting some additional join keys if that's required. So that once you make that election on how you want to join the data and you pick the columns that you want to keep from between the two data sets, now I have, when I add this to my script, a blended data set of my somewhat semi-structured news data blended with my Trader desktop data. And this is now something that I can push down and run at scale on Cloudera and receive my output that I might want to use for my visualization. When I go ahead and I push that down, what you'll receive at the end of that run is a series of information that would look like this. We're pointing out the summary of the validity of the data set across the full run of the data. We'll also show you what the environmentals were on where that ran, some of the same familiar looking histograms about the attributes of the data, so that you can see that if there are any issues you might need to recorrect or fix, you have that opportunity to go back and do that with the hope that after one or two iterations, that data is complete and it's been landed back out in the file system, in the location where the user has the security access, permission, and privilege to grab that data. And so that's very important because we allow the framework that you're implementing on your Hadoop cluster to be the security framework that we inherit. So we want to be good citizens on the cluster, so we have a very lightweight installation, and we'll inherit those security access roles that you already set forth on your cluster. And so that once you have this data done, you can write this out to something like a Tableau TDE for visualization, or any of your other visualization tools will allow you to publish this to things like Hive or HCatalog for querying with things like Impala and others. But also, the goal for this whole thing would be to allow this data to land in a visualization that might look something like this at the end of the day, where what we're looking at now is the data loaded into the visualization where we can see that the data we prepared is pointing out this sort of abnormal spike here in the IBM security. And we can go ahead and notice that that spike is breaking sometime around the news feed, and there's our profit warning that we were writing out earlier. So just to kind of give a flavor of what you could do in order to see that you can build these dashboard elements and prepare the data very quickly for something that would be very useful in this way. And all of this data that I've created and I've worked with and I've been working on is available. We have a very tight integration with Cloudera, in this case with Navigator. So what you'll see is in the Navigator in the Navigator screen, and I don't know how many of you are using Navigator or are familiar with it, this is Cloudera's Navigator, and what we've done is we've integrated with that so that all of the tracking lineage and metadata about the users, their roles and permissions, and what they're ultimately doing to prepare the data set is being stored here. So you can see the steps that they took to prepare the data, and you can go back and see where did that data originate and where is it ultimately landing, so that now you have a complete picture of the folks that are going ahead and wrangling the data in your organization. So that's what I have for you there.
And it does kind of look like magic. I mean, especially if you've ever had to deal with these files, it really is. I mean, like, you know, I regularly bring these guys into customers because it makes such a difference. Having the data in a data hub is one thing. Being able to wrangle it and do it in such a productive way is very different. Can we stick up the last slide?
Sure. Yeah.
So just before we go to questions, I just wanted to finish with this. So financial services is a very dominant area for Cloudera. I joined Cloudera because of the stuff we were doing around governance 2 years ago when I joined. Security is definitely an area we lead. I won't bore you with the story, but customers like MasterCard use us on a fully PCI compliant hub. We're the only vendor that's been able to get through that PCI compliant check, not once but twice now with MasterCard. And as a result, we have a huge following in the financial services. It's why my job is so fun. And what's really interesting now is the financial services companies that are really at the cutting edge don't talk about what they're doing because it's such a competitive differentiator. So, you know, it's a huge area for us. We have a few minutes for questions, so, and it makes it, we've done this presentation a lot of times, so the questions are what makes it interesting for us. So if there are any questions, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, one thing I would say though too, just everything you've seen, this is a slide that's in the deck, basically speaking to the fact that Trifecta is free to download. So if any of you have interest in using a tool like that to try to prepare some data, You can go ahead and download that from our website. It'll run on your desktop. It'll allow you to start working with your own data sets and start doing some of that preparation visually and see the effects of it in your own environment.
Are there any questions out there in the audience? Or?
You mentioned unstructured data. I was wondering if PDF extraction is something that you've mastered yet.
Yeah, PDF extraction can be interesting, right? It depends on whether it's an OCR image or is it some data that's been extracted. We have the ability to rip some of those apart pretty good. It really kind of is a case-by-case basis, so those are things that we are getting into, though.
Okay, thank you.
And so separate to that, I mean, obviously, the Trifecta stuff is awesome once it's in the cluster. There are a lot of partners that will ingest stuff in through different sources like PDF. There's also NLP vendors. There's also vendors that will do speech to text. And this is obviously an interesting use case because of the fraud piece. But there are, Hadoop really doesn't care whether it's an image, audio, etc. And the funny thing is, you can learn a lot if you're just looking at a customer journey. If a customer is spending 5.5 minutes on a call with one of your call center reps, you don't even need to look in too much detail. You know that something good or bad is happening. So you can also go to the next level and do so there's a whole, the nice thing about Cloudera is the ecosystem, and we validate all these partners. These are all certified. They have to go through extensive tests. The Trifecta guys go the extra step. They integrate with Sentry and Navigator, Cloudera Manager, so there's a very deep level of integration there. Any more questions?
Yes. So in the initial stage of wrangling the data, could the user, in addition to the swiping, because let's picture a huge data set, could they say, I'd like you to look at this data set and also look at it against this set of either stock ticker symbols or whatever other data set you might have that you want to look for, rather than swipe, swipe, swipe and have it do the machine learning?
Yeah, you could. And
Okay.
so that would be something that we would register as one of those custom patterns I was talking about, and it would start to present that to you immediately.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Okay, so we kind of covered this, but next steps, you can download the Trifecta software and test drive it yourself. There's training courses available, and please reach out to us. But hopefully that was useful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.